All right, hello, Theater 319. We're going to talk about America and race, a brief, haha, discussion, as if you could possibly make this discussion brief. There are entire classes, entire minors, entire majors, entire graduate programs devoted to tiny little corners of this enormous issue. So, I am not pretending for 1 second that ahead of your reading of the play for Colored Girls, a production of which you can see as our background here, I'm not pretending for 1 second that we can actually talk about America and race in a deep and thorough way, right? But I am going to ask us to touch on and kind of talk about some of the issues. So, one of the things that I always want to ask is what is it exactly we are talking about when we talk about race? And in order to help us sort of illustrate that within this class, I would like in the online discussion document for you each to pick one recent cultural manifestation of the issue of race in America today. I mean anything, folks, right? News item, scandal, celebrity, work of art, movie, sport, event, recent Supreme Court decision regarding, I don't know, college admissions, right? Like, pick something, just one thing, and then ask yourself, why is this issue, scandal, etc. important? How does this issue summarize what we talk about when we talk about race? What's at stake? What topics are being argued about, right? Have that conversation in the discussion document, and then pause and actually go ahead and do that. Pause me and go ahead and do that now if you want, and then come back. So assuming you pause me, now you're back. Here are, and I'm curious to see what of my things fit into your observations, right? Here's some of the things that I keep seeing history come back to again and again are defining issues about America and race. Number one, power and privilege, right? This is terminology and sort of lenses and perspectives that we're really familiar with today. Political power, who votes, who doesn't vote. Economic power, how much money a given class of people has or doesn't have. Who's got the money, who's got the power, who do they hold, who do they wield it over, right? Then identity, another really common thing, but right, labels, stereotypes, expectations. Whose culture is what and who gets to express that culture in what way. Going all the way back to the Uncle Tom's Cabin stuff, we talked about ownership of identity, right? This fundamental idea that Uncle Tom's Cabin, though it was a politically very radically progressive play, was also deeply problematically racist because it allowed very little ownership of Black identity by Black people, right? As we talked about in performance, everyone that was Black in Uncle Tom's Cabin on stage was played by a white person. At least they're going on in an anti-slavery direction, so that's not nothing. We also talked about minstrelsy, at the core of which is ownership of identity. That is white people deciding how culture would perceive Black people and doing it by erasing Black people altogether. The past. It's history. We got to talk about the past, right? It's important to remember with history, there's no such thing as normal, right? Everyone in, well, not everyone, the vast majority of people in Georgia in 1850 thought slavery was normal. The vast majority of people in South Carolina in 1890 thought that Black people still shouldn't vote, right? There's no normal. And where we are today isn't normal either. So we always have to look at time, place, orientation as like, right? The questions to ask instead of calling something normal or not are how did we get here? How much should the past affect the present? So for instance, as you read for Colored Girls, think about how did the women in this play get to where they are, both personally, because they tell a lot of their stories, but also how did the culture they live in get to be the way it is? And then how much should that past affect the present? A lot of people, and I don't agree with them, but a lot of people want to have this ahistorical view of the world, right? Like, oh, we don't really need to talk about race anymore because the civil rights movement happened. Dust off your hands, don't need to worry about it, right? Well, actually, that's not how it works. Just like when slavery ended, the past didn't suddenly disappear. When we got through the civil rights movement, civil rights issues didn't suddenly disappear. They're still obviously very present today. But there's a debate overall about how much should the past affect the present. The future. How do we go forward? Whose change are we talking about, right? And how does it happen? And the how intersects with a lot of these issues above, right? The past, identity, power, privilege. How does change happen? So when I talk about race, these are four of the things I find myself continually coming back to. It's not a complete list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it is a good place to start. So let's talk a little bit about, changing gears, the history of Black performance culture in America. As I mentioned a second ago, like the last time we left off on Black performance culture, it was minstrelsy, which is done by white people in blackface. Now, asterisk, there were Black minstrel troupes as well, but those Black minstrel troupes mainly performed the same white stereotypes that the white minstrel troupes performed. Here we come to the Harlem Renaissance, this 1920s explosion of Black arts and culture that begins in Harlem. There's the Cotton Club in the upper left-hand corner. This is one of the famous Black artists of the day on the right, and a picture of one of those kind of places. And we've got these guys whose names I can't remember right now, but a really famous duo, Dancing Brothers here, right? So the Harlem Renaissance starts in Harlem, hence the name, but also spreads out all over the country to where part of the Roaring Twenties was the development of a lot of Black culture in America in the mainstream in ways it hadn't really been before. Here's an example of the mainstream. This is the first Black authored, Black created musical on Broadway. It's called Shuffle Along, and it's essentially a musical review, right? There's Josephine Baker. You've probably heard her name before, really famous singer and Black Star of the Day. You can count her out. She's ninth from the right? But Shuffle Along was remarkable because it had Black creators telling Black stories on stage, and it made $1 bazillion, right? It was not problematic, but it was a good example of the challenges of history, on the other hand, because it was just a musical review. Now, it was all Black music, and it was Black culture being put out towards white people, which is a good thing, but it was only the palatable sides of the Black experience, right? And I'll talk about some contradictions there. But it was primarily the palatable, fun sides of the Black experience. Similar to the way in which white people were like, oh, look, Black people invented jazz. This is fun and easy. We're going to take jazz and make it our thing, too. Shuffle Along becomes this hit musical, and then you've got a whole bunch of white producers running around Harlem looking for the next Shuffle Along, not because they want to forward Black culture, but because they want to make a lot of money. Now, this play did both. It forwarded Black culture and it made a lot of money. And, as we've talked about this semester, if you want to make a lot of money, you can't piss off your audience. And Shuffle Along did not. So it was remarkable and progressive and pretty amazing, and also a really good example that progress is, relative. Here's a different version of something that came out of the Harlem Renaissance, and this is Langston Hughes. He's the one who wrote the poem A Dream Deferred, that is the inspiration for the title of the play, A Raisin in the Sun. This is a little later, this is 1935, and his play Mulatto is about a mixed race character who's raised on a southern plantation. He's not a slave, this is present day, but just because slavery ended doesn't mean that oppressive working conditions suddenly ended on plantations in the South. So, mixed race character, his mother is a Black worker on the plantation, and his father is the white plantation owner who won't acknowledge the parenthood. This is the other sort of Black storytelling that came out of the Harlem Renaissance, right? Unapologetic, realistic, and sort of peeling back the curtain of romance that a lot of Americans had about the South and saying, look, here's the way it is. And it's a tough play. It's a really good play, but it's tough. And it did not make $1 million, and it did not go to Broadway for reasons you can imagine, right? But I use these two plays, Shuffle Along and Mulatto. It's not that one's better than the other or anything. It's just they're different examples of what kind of stuff was going on at the time. Okay, so we move out of the Harlem Renaissance, and I just want to talk briefly about the American Negro Theater, ANT. Based in Harlem, grew from the Negro Theater wing of the Federal Theater Project. When we talk about the Depression and the Federal Theater Project, this is one of the parts that they shut the Federal Theater Project down because they thought it was too political, but the organizers moved forward and created the American Negro Theater. This is Black stars doing all kinds of different things, right? Look on the right, Juno and the Paycock by Sean O'Casey. There's a really famous Irish playwright. So they're like, hey, Black people can do Irish plays, why not, right? And a whole lot of other things, examples. Natural Man is a little bit more of a progressive play. Funding and support for Black writers and performers. Over its life, the ANT existed for 9 years, had 325 performances of 19 plays, 12 of which were original by Black artists. So a really big deal, right? Here's their goal. We want to break down the barriers of Black participation in the theater, to portray the Negro life as we honestly saw it, to fill in the gap of a Black theater which did not exist. Really simple, straightforward manifestation, right? This is like, hey, look, we just want to be included in the storytelling that's going on stage in America. We need room to tell our stories too. One of the conflicts was between the playwrights, who wanted to write the more Langston Hughes mulatto kind of hard-hitting realistic stuff, and the actors, some of whom wanted to do that tough stuff, and others of whom wanted to get famous and go to Broadway. And if you go to Broadway, then you're going to be doing stuff that is less hard-hitting. And so a lot of the playwrights said, we need to change the world with this theater company. And a lot of the actors said, yes, but we won't mind going after Broadway. Not a criticism of either group at all, right? I mean, there are tensions like this that exist within any marginalized group, right? Are you right, from inside a marginalized person's community? Are you, quote unquote, selling out? Are you, quote unquote, being real? And all the context that and the complication that exists between those things. Here's another interesting thing about the A&T. Their biggest hit was Anna Lukasta by the Polish playwright Philip Jordan. Anna Lukasta is a play about Polish peasants. They just cast it with Black people, right? We'll talk about the drama school in a minute. They just cast Anna Lukasta with Black people. A lot of class-related things that were going on in Poland during the time that Anna Lukasta set that definitely related to the challenges that Black folks have had in America. So there are some parallels here, but it's interesting that one of the big goals of the A&T was to develop Black playwrights, but their biggest hit was from a Polish playwright. That's not a critique of the playwright, of the company, of the A&T, none of those things. It's just another interesting observation of progress is important and it's hard to come by. The A&T also created a drama school, Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, who I hope you all have heard of. Huge stars of film and stage, two Black men that were a really big deal in America in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and actually even past then a little bit. In 1947, the A&T kind of merged into the Committee for the Negro in the Arts, and it was the Committee for the Negro in the Arts that Lorraine Hansberry had funding and support from, where she eventually was able to put on Raisin in the Sun in 1959. So I'm going to stop this and make it be the first part of the lecture. I'll come back in the second part and we'll talk about integration and separation.